Buddhism for Today, The Essential Wisdom of the Threefold Lotus Sutra by Nikkyo Niwano. Part 2, The Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma. Chapter 2, Skillful Means. What is skillful means? Often called the core of the manifest dimension, this important chapter, Skillful Means, is the centerpiece of the first half of the Lotus Sutra. Kumarajiva translated the Sanskrit term upaya, or skillful means, into Chinese using two characters, fang and bian. Fang originally signified a square or something that is square in shape and, by extension, that which is right, correct, true, or straight. Bian indicates a method or means. Together, fangbian, or hoben in Japanese, signifies a right or appropriate method or a right or appropriate means. In an unfortunate turn, however, skillful means later took on a cynical connotation, as evidenced by the Japanese saying, "A lie is also a skillful means." In other words, sometimes it is necessary to stretch the truth, which is comparable to the idiom, "The ends justify the means." Originally, however, skillful means signifies a method of teaching and transforming living beings in a way that is perfectly appropriate to the person and in accord with the circumstances. Unless we understand the actual intent of skillful means and always keep it firmly in mind, we will not be able to truly understand this critical chapter of the Lotus Sutra. As we read in the previous chapter, Manjushri foresaw that the Buddha was about to reveal his most supreme awakening and that it would surely be his final teaching. Hearing this news, all the living beings gathered at Divine Eagle Peak wait in eager anticipation for the Buddha to begin speaking. Finally, the Buddha quietly emerges from samadhi in an unhurried manner and turns to address Shariputra. The wisdom of Buddhas is extremely profound and infinite, and because of this they can perceive the ultimate reality of all things. Their wisdom is difficult to comprehend and not easy to learn. None of the Shravakas, those who practice by apprenticing themselves, nor any of the Pratyeka Buddhas, those who practice experientially, can apprehend it. Why? Because the Buddhas are preeminent living beings who have been closely associated with and familiar to countless numbers of other Buddhas like them. Practicing each and every teaching without exception, and fearing nothing, they single-mindedly advance on the way. Therefore, their names resound throughout the entire world. Finally, they realize the deeply profound, superb teaching that until now no ordinary living being had attained. People of shallow practice cannot possibly understand it. The Buddhas have expounded this teaching in numerous ways according to what was appropriate to individual listeners. Living beings who received the teachings of the Buddhas had no idea of their purpose, however, because the ultimate intention of the Buddhas was difficult to understand. Shariputra, since I became Buddha, I have taught, using various examples from the past, many parables, and countless methods and means, to lead living beings to awakening, enabling them to free themselves from all their attachments that stem from a self-centered way of thinking. The Buddhas can do this because they have completely mastered both the skillful means necessary to lead all living beings and the paramita of knowledge and insight, which is the ability to fully perceive the ultimate reality of all things. Shariputra, this wisdom, this ability to penetrate the ultimate reality of all things, is truly great and profound. The Tathagatas discern all things without impediments, from the infinite past to the infinite future. They have obtained the four infinitely virtuous minds that are beyond even the imagination of ordinary living beings. The first is the infinitely virtuous mind of benevolence, the wish that one's own life will make others happy. The second is the infinitely virtuous mind of compassion, the desire that one's own actions will alleviate the sufferings of other living beings. The third is the infinitely virtuous mind of sympathetic joy, which rejoices in the happiness of other beings. And finally, the fourth is the infinitely virtuous mind of impartiality, which forgets the slights inflicted by others and lays vengefulness aside, but also abandons preoccupation with the benefits and rewards of one's own good actions. The Buddhas embody many magnificent powers, including their ability to expound the Dharma, which is perfect and flawless because they possess the four types of unhindered wisdom. The Buddhas are also in full command of the 10 powers that come with the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas. The Buddhas expound the Dharma with no apprehension or anxiety, because they are equipped with the 4 kinds of fearlessness. Their minds are tranquil and immovable in meditation. Their emancipation frees them from all delusions, and, because of their samadhis, they can concentrate their minds unwaveringly on a single thought. Because the Buddhas embody such tremendous abilities, they have completely mastered the infinitely profound truth. Moreover, they perceive what no one else in their world knows and have attained the way that no one else in their world has accomplished. Shariputra, the Tathagatas are able to know the hearts and minds of every one of their listeners. They tailor their explanations of the Dharma to each listener, and, because they teach with tender words, the hearts of all those who listen are filled with joy. Shariputra, the sum and substance of what I have just explained to you is that the Buddhas have fully realized the supreme truth that ordinary beings cannot even begin to imagine, a truth that no one except the Buddhas has fully attained. The 3 refusals and 3 requests. At this point in his explanation, the Buddha abruptly falls silent. After a short time, however, he begins to speak again. That is enough, Shariputra. Even if I attempt to explain this, it would be impossible for you to understand. Why? The supreme truth that the Buddhas have mastered is unlike anything in this world, and ordinary living beings cannot possibly comprehend it. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fathom this truth that is the ultimate reality of all things. So you must become a Buddha in order to perfectly understand it. The ultimate reality of all things permeates everything that exists, and is the principle by which the external appearances, natures, and embodiments of all phenomena manifest in our world. According to this principle, all phenomena have a corresponding appearance, nature, and embodiment. Phenomena also possess their own corresponding potentials and functions, which are their latent capabilities and their activity respectively. A phenomenon's nature and potential are in harmony with each other, and, as they change in tandem, the function of the phenomenon also changes, becoming a corresponding cause whenever it encounters another phenomenon that interacts with it as a condition. And, according to the condition, this interaction produces a corresponding effect, which is an immediate phenomenal result. The principle of ultimate reality also indicates that this effect leaves behind an enduring after effect, which is called its corresponding reward. Finally, all phenomena are always in a corresponding state of ultimate identity with one another, because, whether or not they possess physical form, the way every single thing exists is not only appropriate to the thing itself, but also corresponds to this universal principle. These 10 aspects of how things really exist are called the teaching of the 10 suchnesses, because as they appear in the text of this sutra, all the terms are preceded by the word such an appearance, such a nature, such an embodiment, such a potential, such a function, such a cause, such a condition, such an effect, such a reward, and, from the first to the last, such an ultimate identity. As the Buddha explained, the principle of the 10 suchnesses is a truth that permeates all things in the universe. Here, the Buddha also shows us that living beings can experience any of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. That is, we can experience any possible reality within a single thought. This principle is an extension of the 10 suchnesses. However, just as Shakyamuni Buddha hesitated to explain the 10 suchnesses in detail here, in Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, for now I will defer an in-depth discussion of both the 10 suchnesses and the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought until later. Next, in order to restate what he had just explained to Shariputra, the Buddha repeats the teaching in a verse along the following lines. The knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas is unfathomable. This wisdom is not something I obtained easily, but finally accomplished only after receiving the teachings of countless Buddhas throughout my former lives, and after cultivating practice for an extremely long time. This is a supreme wisdom I attained by ceaselessly polishing the faculties of my mind. Therefore, not even the Shravakas, greatest of the wise people of the world, not one of the Pratyeka Buddhas of keen intelligence, awoken through their own experiences, not the novice Bodhisattvas who aspired to the same awakening as the Buddha and practiced together with the great mass of people, and not even the non-regressing Bodhisattvas, whose practice is considerably advanced, can comprehend the wisdom of the Buddha. I know this profound truth completely and exhaustively, just as do all the Buddhas of the universe. Although the Buddhas expound many different teachings, the basis of each is the same fundamental truth. For this reason, you must understand that even if the manifestations differ, as long as they are the teachings of a Buddha, the foundation is always the same one truth. Expressing this universal truth in various ways and through different methods, skillful means, is indispensable and worthy of esteem. In order to help beginners on the Buddha way escape the delusions and sufferings of their daily lives, I have used 3 teachings. which are called the three vehicles: an apprentice's teaching for the Shravakas, an experientialist teaching for the Pratyeka Buddhas, and an activist teaching for the Bodhisattvas, which leads them to attain their own liberation through the work of liberating others. These three teachings demonstrate the greatness of the Buddha's power of skillful means. Listening to the Buddha explain this teaching, the living beings in the assembly became confused and are perplexed as to why the Buddha repeatedly praises the use of skillful means. They all think to themselves, "Until now the Buddha has taught that this world is transient, all things are constantly changing, and he told us that because of this we must be free of attachments. After strenuous practice, we have finally attained the state of mind that is free from attachments, and now the Buddha tells us that we are incapable of understanding his wisdom. What does the Buddha mean by all this?" It's no surprise that Shariputra, first in wisdom among the Buddha's disciples, senses these doubts that all in the assembly harbor, and, since he himself has also failed to understand what the Buddha has just taught them, he addresses the Buddha asking, "World-honored one, why do you say that skillful means is the foremost dharma of the Buddhas, repeatedly extolling its virtues? I myself have never heard such a teaching from you before, and everyone in the assembly is completely puzzled. We beg of you, could you explain this to us in a way that is easy for us to understand?" Then, in order to emphasize what he had intended to say, Shariputra repeats his request in verse. But the Buddha says to Shariputra, "No, that is enough. There is no need to say more. If I explain this matter, all the people and heavenly beings in the world would be shocked and perplexed, and, if anything, it would discourage them in their practice. It would be better not to explain this." The Buddha's reticence only makes Shariputra's passion for the truth burn brighter, however, and he refuses to be discouraged from asking the Buddha to elaborate. Again he appeals to the Buddha. "World-honored one, please explain this, I implore you. All the living beings gathered here have studied under the Buddhas for ages, and they have the superior ability to comprehend difficult teachings. If they could only receive your teaching, no matter how difficult, they would certainly be able to have faith in it and put it into practice." Despite this second request, the Buddha declines once again, replying, "No, I was right to refuse explaining this any further. If people who arrogantly consider themselves already fully awakened were to hear my explanation, it would certainly cause doubts in their minds, or make them scornfully reply that what I teach is impossible to put into practice." Despite the Buddha's repeated refusals, Shariputra remains persistent and, once again, puts his question to the Buddha. This time, the Buddha simply gazes intently at Shariputra for a moment, but then he nods his head with an air of satisfaction and finally begins to speak. "Shariputra, I am impressed by your eager persistence. Since you have already passionately repeated your plea 3 times, how can I refuse? I will explain this for you in greater detail so that you will understand it well. Still your mind and listen intently. Once you have heard this teaching, go over it thoroughly so that you grasp it fully." The departure of the 5,000. Just as the Buddha finishes speaking, 5,000 monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen stand up from their seats and, bowing in respect to the Buddha, depart the assembly. They do so because the lingering karmic obstructions of their past actions are so heavy that they make them too uncomfortable to remain in their seats. Their arrogant assumption that they are already truly enlightened leaves them uninterested in the Buddha's words, so they depart. The world-honored one is silent and makes no attempt to stop them. He does so because he concludes that even if he were to force them to remain, they would not understand what he was about to teach, and he is concerned that it would instead affect them adversely. He also knows that someday the desire to seek the true teaching will arise in their hearts, at a time when they have developed the capacity to actually comprehend it. The Buddha concludes that expounding the supreme teaching to them for the first time after such conditions have ripened will be the most direct path to liberation for them. At first glance, the Buddha seems to be displaying an indifference towards them, but behind this seeming lack of concern is the fullness of the Buddha's great wisdom and mind of compassion. This becomes clear much later in the episode in Chapter 8, the assurance of Buddhahood given to the 500 disciples, in which the Buddha gives many arhats guarantees that they can attain Buddhahood if they diligently practice. In Chapter 8, the Buddha says to Mahakashyapa, "And so it will be with the other Shravakas of this multitude. With regard to those not present in this assembly, you must convey all of these matters for their sake as well." The Buddha's words, "those not present in this assembly," refer to the 5,000 people who departed the assembly at the beginning. The fact that the Buddha does not stop them from leaving demonstrates his great power of skillful means. Once these arrogant 5,000 have departed, only earnest seekers of the way remain in the assembly. Seeing this, the Buddha again turns to Shariputra and returns to teaching the Dharma. The Udambara flower blooms only once in 3,000 years. The wondrous Dharma I am going to explain to you now is as rare to hear as the blossoming of the Udambara flower. Buddhas teach this Dharma only when they think the time is right, so you have encountered a rare opportunity. Shariputra, believe me when I tell you that among the teachings of the Buddhas, there are absolutely no falsehoods or lies. Listen carefully with your heart and mind to what I am about to tell you. The Buddhas use a variety of skillful means to explain the Dharma, including examples from the past, parables, logical explanations, and more, but their purpose for doing this is difficult to fully grasp. The Buddhas appear in the world for only one great cause. What is the one great cause of the Buddha's appearance in the world? It is none other than to lead living beings to truly understand the reason for their existence. In short, for them to attain the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas. If each living being understands this truth, they can become a Buddha and will be able to attain true happiness. Opening, demonstrating, realizing, and embarking. The Buddha continues, for all living beings to attain the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas, all living beings must first realize that they themselves possess Buddha nature. When they understand that they share the same essence with the Buddha, their awakening naturally washes away petty egotism, leaving their minds pure and bright. The Buddhas appear in the world to open people's eyes to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas in this fashion. In other words, to reveal this very wisdom to people. To those who awaken to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas then clearly demonstrate the reality of the world as it is seen through the eyes of their knowledge and insight. This is demonstrating the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. If living beings see the reality of the world through the eyes of the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas, they will then realize that the world is actually in a state of peace and comfort with no suffering. This is realizing the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. Living beings do not automatically attain this state of mind, however. They first embark on the way only with diligence and great persistence. The Buddhas appear in the world to encourage all living beings to embark on the way of the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. In short, the Buddhas desire to lead all living beings to fathom the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. They accomplish this through the skillful sequence of first opening living beings' eyes to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas, then demonstrating it to them, next allowing them to realize it, and, finally, ensuring that they embark on the way of the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. This and this alone is the one great cause of the Buddha's appearance in the world. All of those whom the Buddhas teach and transform are bodhisattvas. After explaining the one great cause of the Buddha's appearance in the world, Shakyamuni's demeanor turns serious and his tone becomes more intensely focused. And then he tells Shariputra, in the exact words of the sutra, all those whom the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform are bodhisattvas. These words are also extremely important for us. We might be tempted to think that when the Buddha says, all of those whom the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform are bodhisattvas, he also means, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are not my true disciples. But such an understanding would contradict what the Buddha had just finished explaining, that Buddhas appear in the world to lead all sentient beings to discover the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. After carefully considering the meaning of the Buddha's words, we realize that what he says is always consistent. There are many teachings within Buddhism that seem to contradict one another. Many apparent inconsistencies can be found even in the Lotus Sutra. The Buddha, however, never makes a contradictory statement. He speaks directly, but if we adopt a shallow interpretation of his words, we will not be able to grasp their larger implications and will instead see the Buddha's words as inconsistent. When we read the Buddha's teaching superficially, we may end up confused and wrongly conclude that it is simply not possible to make any sense of the Buddha Dharma, or that Buddhism is suspect because its teachings are inconsistent. For this reason, we must read the sutras with great care. Those who find the Lotus Sutra difficult should read it repeatedly to acquire a basic understanding. If the sutra still does not make sense, they should ask someone well acquainted with it to help them with difficult passages. Arbitrarily concluding that the teachings of Buddhism are worthless because at first glance they seem to contain inconsistencies is a mistake. This problem perfectly illustrates why we must firmly receive and embrace the Lotus Sutra. When we first pick up the sutra, we may find it challenging, but if we persevere and refuse to give up, we will surely understand it one day. Shakyamuni's words, All of those whom the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform are bodhisattvas, are meant to show that as long as we think that obtaining realization for ourselves is enough, the realization we seek will not be true awakening. Furthermore, if you are convinced that you yourself are enlightened, but nobody else around you is, your attitude alone is proof positive that you are detached from and indifferent toward other living beings. You cannot achieve oneness with others. Such a sentiment is one of solitude, even isolation. Because your egotistical and isolated sense of self remains, you have not reached the state of realizing the second seal of the Dharma, the principle that all things are non-self, that everything is interdependent. This is precisely why your realization is not full awakening. In truth, our awakening entails others' awakening. We are liberated from our suffering as the rest of humanity is liberated from its suffering. Our liberation from suffering is interdependent with and inseparable from the liberation of others. The only true liberation is for all to be liberated together. When you understand the meaning of true liberation, you have attained true enlightenment, and have been set free from the bonds of delusion and suffering in our world. A mere step we take toward awakening makes a crucial difference in our lives. In the anecdote from mathematician Yoichi Yoshida's childhood, mentioned in the preface, we read that when his knowledge of mathematics was still limited to decimal arithmetic, he discovered that it was impossible to divide 1 by 3 evenly without a repeating remainder. After struggling with this problem, he came close to solving it by imagining a kind of number similar to the fraction 1 over 3. But he just could not get all the way to the solution on his own. The moment he was taught fractions, however, he was instantly able to grasp the solution. The same thing can be said for awakening. As long as people, even those of great wisdom like Shariputra, seek enlightenment for themselves and yearn for liberation solely for their own sake, despite having nearly attained the Buddha's realization, the short leap between their state and Buddhahood is like a great gulf that is impossible to cross. But they can bridge the gap as soon as they realize that true liberation means liberating together with the great mass of living beings. This is the true meaning of the Buddha's statement, all of those whom the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform are bodhisattvas. The Buddha says this in order to emphasize that only bodhisattvas, those who practice to liberate all living beings, can fully grasp the meaning of the Buddha's teachings. Only one Buddha vehicle. Once the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas set out to practice the Bodhisattva way, they become true disciples, true children of the Buddha. The Buddha's intention is not to alienate the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas with his words, but to lead them to the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas. The Buddha demonstrates this when he next says, Shariputra, the Buddha expounds the Dharma for living beings using the one Buddha vehicle. In reality, there are no second or third vehicles. There is only one vehicle. The implication of the one vehicle is that ultimately all people can become Buddhas. The awakenings attained by Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas are all, equally, realizations through which one can become a Buddha, because the basis of all these awakenings is the same. Some people realize the awakening of a Shravaka, and others realize the awakening of a Pratyeka Buddha. Both of these aspects of awakening are entrances to the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas. We can understand this by using the analogy of a house. All who go through the gate and proceed to the house must first pass through the entrance hall, the foyer or vestibule, of Bodhisattva practice to reach the inner parlor of the wisdom of the Buddha. The gate and entrance hall are certainly located on the grounds of the Buddha's mansion, part of his magnificent residence. If we remain at the gate, we will get drenched when it rains and freeze when it snows. So the Buddha encourages us to enter the house and come into the parlor that is his wisdom. The eastern gate, the western gate, the front porch are all entrances that lead to the house and into the interior room of the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas. This analogy illustrates what the Buddha means when he says, there is no vehicle besides the one Buddha vehicle. There is neither a second nor a third. I have displayed the appearance of 3 separate vehicles through the use of skillful means. There is only one true goal for all. If we get the basic point, we will readily understand the more detailed explanation of the one Buddha vehicle that appears in both the prose section and the verses that come later in this chapter. Here, I will provide only a synopsis, explaining difficult terms and important points that some readers might find confusing. As discussed before, the one great cause of the Buddha's appearance in the world is to enable all living beings to awaken to the knowledge and insight of the Buddhas. In other words, Buddhas appear so that all living beings will realize they themselves can also become Buddhas. The Buddhas actually have only one teaching, but because living beings are captivated by powerful desires, and because of the great distance that separates the Buddha from living beings born in the evil age of the 5 decays, Buddhas create divisions within the one Buddha vehicle and teach it as if there were 3 separate vehicles, the Shravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and Bodhisattva vehicles. In this passage, the Buddha uses the phrase deep attachments to shed light on the functioning of the deepest levels of the human mind. Even if delusions are absent from the surface of a person's mind, they remain in the subconscious. Given the right conditions, they can arise again through the force of habit, because our past actions, karma, have deposited a residue of latent habits that remain deeply ingrained in our minds like buried seeds. Other explanations compare these deep attachments to a lingering odor that overwhelms our minds. To give an example, even though someone promises themselves that they will never again lose their temper and will succeed in keeping their emotions on an even keel, because this residue remains in their minds, they may explode in anger when they experience a humiliating insult. As long as we do not remove these deep attachments hidden in the depths of our minds, we will not be completely liberated from the bonds of delusion and suffering. Shakyamuni Buddha taught, some 2,500 years ago, what modern psychologists and the medical profession have only recently come to acknowledge, that the subconscious mind has a great influence on our health and well-being. The evil age of the 5 decays. As written in the sutra, the Buddha next says to Shariputra, the Buddhas appear in the evil age of the 5 decays, the deterioration of the kalpa, festering of delusions, degeneration of living beings, degeneration of views, and diminishing lifespans. Part of Buddhism's concept of time is the notion of the 5 decays. The first of these decays is the deterioration of the kalpa, a worsening of conditions that takes place because one particular kalpa, an extremely long period of time, continues for an immense span of time. When any status quo is maintained for many years, all sorts of evil arise, just as hardening of the arteries develops with age and exerts an unfavorable influence on our physical health. The world sometimes needs to usher in a new age, just as living beings require fresh air to preserve their health. The second decay is the festering of delusions, and, as its name suggests, it means that living beings behave foolishly because of the defilement caused by their delusions. Crime and immorality become increasingly rampant over time because of the festering of delusions. The third decay is the degeneration of living beings, which refers to the conflicts that arise because of superficial differences in the character of living beings. Disputes transpire among individuals, discord ensues within families, and the wider society falls into a state of disorder because, not realizing that all living beings are permeated by one universal life, each exerts its own egotistical sense of self. The fourth decay is the degeneration of views, the disorder and social unrest that arise in the world because of the conflicting perspectives of living beings. Viewpoints clash and people act at cross purposes because of their narrow horizons, which are rooted in self-centeredness. If living beings adopted the proper way of looking at things shown by the teachings of the Buddha, disputes would naturally come to an end, and humanity would realize a world of peace. Finally, the fifth decay is diminishing lifespans, which means there is no rest from the endless, harsh rat race that the world has become. Because of the shortened lives in the evil age of the 5 decays, the thinking and conduct of living beings revolve around nothing but the pursuits of immediate results and short-term gain. There is no respite, because they trouble themselves over trivial things. If living beings could only awaken to their timeless, true nature, Buddha nature, they would be liberated from their suffering. In the evil age of the 5 decays, the delusions of living beings simply run far too deep to allow them to jump directly to the supreme teaching. They cannot possibly understand it. This is why the Buddha set up divisions within the one Buddha vehicle, to lead people gradually to realization through 3 vehicles. The 3 are the Shravaka vehicle, a kind of apprenticeship in which people first learn by studying the Buddha's teachings and then following them to remove delusions from their minds. The Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, an experientialist approach for those who are not satisfied with simply listening to the teachings and following them, but are instead determined to realize the truth by and for themselves through their own experience. And the Bodhisattva vehicle, an activist strategy for those who realize that private liberation for oneself is not full liberation, and that one is truly liberated through the work of liberating others. When living beings recognize that these three divisions within the one Buddha vehicle are the skillful means of the Buddha, they will cherish them and understand that skillful means is the great way that leads to the truth. When skillful means is realized as the great way, all living beings can enter the Buddha way from any point. As the concluding verse of this chapter tells us, living beings can enter through paying homage to the relics of the Buddha, by building stupas and memorials, by piling up the earth to build shrines to the Buddha in the wilderness, or even by playfully heaping up sand to form a Buddha stupa. Living beings can enter the Buddha way by doing anything good. Gaining merit in developing the great compassionate heart of the Buddha, they can finally become Buddhas themselves. The Buddha says in the exact language of the sutra, "Such people as these have my assurance that, in a future lifetime, they will complete the Buddha way." We should be careful how we understand the phrase, "in a future lifetime," however. This should not be read to mean after death, but that one will attain the way sometime in the future, when one's practice has advanced step by step. The Lotus Sutra teaches us that on awakening, one immediately becomes a Buddha, and this world instantly transforms into a realm of eternally tranquil light, the realm of the Buddha. The Buddhist paradise of the Pure Land is not something for which we have to wait until after death. The Lotus Sutra tells us that the paradise of the Pure Land is found within our hearts and experienced in our daily lives. Returning to the text of the sutra, in this verse that concludes chapter 2, we also find the following line. In the end, by a lesser vehicle, the Buddhas do not convey living beings to liberation. This passage is often misinterpreted to mean that, in truth, living beings are not liberated by lesser vehicles, a misunderstanding that causes many people to see an inconsistency in the Buddha's benevolence. But the real meaning of these words is that the Buddhas do not lead living beings to full liberation by the lesser vehicles alone. That is to say, the Buddhas liberate living beings to a great degree through the lesser vehicles, but they cannot lead living beings to the final, supreme liberation by those vehicles alone. The Buddha ends his discussion of the Dharma in chapter 2 with inspiring words. Shariputra, the Dharma of the Buddhas is like this. The Buddhas employ innumerable skillful means to teach the Dharma appropriately in response to the person and circumstances. It is essential that you learn the Dharma by repeatedly putting it into practice, confirming it in light of its applicability to the experience of your daily life. Those without sufficient study and practice will not fully realize the one great cause of the Buddha's appearance in the world, to lead all living beings to the same state as the Buddha by teaching them step by step how to attain it. You, Shariputra, and all the others in this assembly, already know that the Buddhas make appropriate use of skillful means. With no more doubt remaining in your hearts, you should rejoice, as you now realize for yourselves that you, too, will become Buddhas.